Joining me this evening are special guest Alan Essig, Executive Director of the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute, and Kelly McCutchen, President of the Georgia Public Policy Foundation. Thank you both for joining me, and it ought to be obvious why both of you are here this evening. We're going to talk about the budget and the challenges therein. And it certainly is an austere year, and we'll get to that. Our prime topic this evening, the state of the budget. The Joint Appropriations Committee held their first budget hearings in 2011 on Tuesday, January 18th, and Governor Nathan Deal outlined his budget priorities. Let's take a look.
I do not believe we should spend additional revenue if actual collections, in fact, were good enough to exceed our estimate. We must replenish the revenue shortfall reserve, and that's what I think hopefully you will be committed with me to doing. I think you all know that the greatest challenge in 2012 is going to be replacing almost $1 billion of the federal stimulus funding that we will not have available to us. In order to keep our budget in balance, state agencies must reduce their spending by an average of 7%. This will mean 4 straight years of budget reductions for our agencies.
Mr. Essig, let's start with you. This is a complicated subject. It's like trying to wrestle an octopus here, and you're dealing with actually not a one-year problem here, right?
This has been going on since the Great Recession started. It's been about 3 or 4 years now. And the total amount the budget's been cut has been about 20%. Some agencies like education, regions have taken a lower cut, but other state agencies like natural resources, labor, and so forth have taken budget cuts of 25 or 30%. So it's been significant. The governor's budget, it's not about just the impact he's having this year compared to last year. It's the total impact over the last 3 or 4 years and what it's done to state services and the core things that Georgians need and demand.
Now we have to remember too that over the past couple of years they've come back midterm and cut a little more and cut a little more and cut a little more, right? This time they're starting with a real austere look, aren't they?
Yeah, I think we've hit bottom, and I think it's, the economy has started to grow, revenues have started to grow. So I think this is with this year, with having to replace the stimulus funds that are in the budget, is causing the biggest part of the deficit we're facing. So we're trying to deal with that, and I think the governor's budget makes the kind of the final cuts to put us even with on what revenues are, and going forward is the new reality we'll be dealing with.
Mr. McCutchen, the real reality here is that they don't have as much money to work with as they've had before.
Well, that's right, but to put it in perspective, Scott, I think you have to look back and you have to look at total dollars, not just state dollars. State dollars are less than half of the total amount of money we spend here in Georgia. And look back in history, in 06 through 08, we spent money very rapidly, $4 billion increase in just those 2 years. The next 2 years, from 2009 actual spending to 2011, this year's budget, spending has gone up $650 million. So this is the tough year, but we get ourselves in trouble when we spend so much money during the good times only to have to do these dramatic cutbacks during the recession.
Well, we have reserves, right? I mean, we
ran through those.
We ran through those pretty quick, didn't we?
That's right. Well, this is a once-in-a-lifetime situation. Typically, those reserves would have been sufficient.
We've been able to grow our way out of these kinds of problems in the past, haven't we?
We have. We've been a very fast-growing state. Our population has been growing. But most recently, we have started to stagnate. We're losing high-paying jobs. We're 49th in the nation in per capita personal income growth because we're losing those high-paying jobs. And our economy and our tax code are not reflecting the overall economy. So we need to do, it's a great opportunity for us to make some substantial changes.
Substantial changes. I want to get back to you on that. Mr. Essig, what do you think about the whole revenue picture? You said we hit the bottom just a moment ago.
Yeah, the revenues are growing. They're growing this fiscal year. The governor's economist projects they'll grow next fiscal year. The question is, are they growing fast enough to meet what the normal budget growth is? We're still one of the fastest growing states in the country. We have more students in K through 12, more students in the border regions. If and until we change our sentencing policy, we have more prisoners, they're older, they're sicker, we have to pay for them. We have a settlement with the Federal Justice Department on mental health services, which means we have to invest more money in that. So we know that the budget's going to grow by a certain amount. And the question is even if we get back to some sense of normal revenue growth, is that enough to meet the needs of the growing population and growing service needs that the state has?
Now, the governor has talked about core services, in outlining his budget priorities. And obviously one of the first ones is public safety in education. Are we going to be able to keep it to that, or is there going to be a lot of pork nipping at the edges here?
I think there'll be very little pork nipping at the edges. I think the budget is austere. I think the governor and the past governor, past General Assembly during this crisis, I think has done a good job of trying to focus funds on where they think the priorities are. If you look at where the state spends their money, 96% of the money is spent on education, healthcare, transportation, human services. I mean, the core priorities. And I think this budget continues that. It's a question of, do we have enough money to do the core things that we need to do, not that we're spending things in other places that should be spent on education.
You talk about, go ahead.
Well, I think Governor Deal deserves a lot of praise because, I think we both have talked about the problem of just doing across-the-board budget cuts. It punishes agencies that have done a very good job managing their budget as well as those that may not have. And I think Governor Deal, not only did he balance the budget this year without a tax increase, but he went in and selectively targeted several agencies for cuts and protected education. And, prioritizing our needs is what we have to do in these periods. It's tough on those that are receiving the cuts, but it's the best long-term policy.
The governor mentioned a bond package in his State of the Budget message, and the biggest part of that was education spending. $230 million, almost half of it, for K through 12 education. Is that something that's going to be looked on favorably?
Well, I think so, but I think he also is realizing we've been borrowing a lot of money over the last few years. We need to scale back on that. So very fiscally conservative across the board. I think the exciting thing is we have opportunities in lots of areas. You look at K-12 education. Florida and North Carolina have similar demographics to Georgia. And if you look on a per student basis, we're spending about $1.5 billion more than both of those states, yet they're getting better results. So there's great opportunities there. And Governor Bush and Governor Wise, former Democrat and Republican governors, have led the Digital Learning Council to show some opportunities. We're using technology, we can reduce costs there. And in prisons, I was very excited. It's something we've been talking about a long time. You have the governor, as well as the Speaker of the House, the Supreme Court Justice, and the minority leader in the House, all agreeing that we've been tough on crime in Georgia for a long time. We need to be smart on crime.
Now, what do you mean by that?
Well, we're number one in the country in the number of adults that are under correctional supervision, 1 out of 13 adults in Georgia, tops in the nation. We can still be tough on crime and save money. Texas, not a easy on crime state,
right.
They have saved $2 billion, and at the same time, they've reduced their crime rate and their recidivism rate by doing some smart things like investing in mental health, investing in alternatives, investing in drug courts. I think you know that Jason Deal, the governor's son, has talked about that and how successful drug courts are. We don't need to be spending so much money locking these individuals up. We need to spend our money for prisons for those that are dangerous.
What is Mr. Essig, $1 billion a year, more or less, to run Georgia's penal system?
Yeah, and it's a cost that's going to only increase, especially the health care part of it. We have a lot more inmates, they're older and they're sicker, and it's Georgia taxpayers have to pay 100% of the health care costs. So I think Kelly's absolutely correct. If we can change sentencing policy, be smarter about who we put in prison, those who are in prison who are dangerous need to stay there. If there are alternatives for nonviolent and drug offenders, first-time offenders, it could save the state a lot of money and improve the criminal justice outcomes in the state.
A nursing home would be a lot cheaper to run than a prison would be, wouldn't it? This is a minimum security nursing home for nonviolent inmates who are cracked a certain age.
And also, in custody, the state cannot take advantage of Medicaid and Medicare, which the federal government, Medicare pays 100% of, and Medicaid they pay a high percentage of. While they're in prison, it's all state costs. If on the outside, the federal government could participate in that. So there's a lot of positive things we can do on corrections reform, which would have a positive impact on the budget, but also have a positive impact on criminal justice as a whole.
That is bold and a new way of thinking. Could you explain briefly what a drug court is?
Well, drug court is where someone has a substance abuse issue, and so many of our inmates in our prisons do. They first go before a judge and receive treatment and supervision. And it prevents them on the front end from going into the prison system. But they have mentors, they are supervised, and I think a Department of Audit's report just came out recently showing that they have a lower recidivism rate and it saves a tremendous amount of money.
All right. I wish we could talk more about the tax reform proposals and everything else that's come up, but in a few words, do you think the governor's pretty well going to have his way on the budget? Mr. Essig, we'll ask you first.
Governors always pretty much have their way in the budget because the most important power the governor has is setting the revenue estimate. General Assembly cannot spend a penny more than the governor says. So it's just the General Assembly, anything they want to add back, they have to cut something else.
And tax reform, Mr. McCutchen, that's likely not to go anywhere this session? What do
No,
you
I think it will. I'm still cautiously optimistic. I think, the Wall Street Journal last week in their editorial page called our state the anti-Illinois state. As Illinois is dramatically increasing income tax rates, our proposal is dramatically reduce income tax rates. We need that to get our economy going, attract those high-wage jobs. So I think, yes, I certainly hope we get that going again.
We could talk to you for an hour about the intricacies here. It is the most important thing before the General Assembly right now. Thank you for your expertise.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And for your service. That's all the time we have for this segment of the program. I'd like to thank my guest, Alan Essig and Kelly McCutchen.